In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there, but Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night, and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me, for your sake, that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her goods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go I will go, and where you lodge I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So the 2 of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the woman said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest.
And it follows them through their tragedies and through their redemption. It makes you think, why is this book here? Well, many of you know that it does have great historical significance, but also I think God just enjoys telling a good story. A good story has a way of taking facts and lessons that we know in our head and putting those deep into our soul, because we understand what ordinary people are going through in their ordinary lives, and we can connect with that. And so, as we go through this series, I want you to lean in, to soak in this book, to pay attention to these themes, to the theme of love, to the theme of commitment, of loyalty, to the theme of redemption, and how through it all it points to Jesus. Now that's my intro for the whole book, so I just want to note for Pastor Mike that doesn't count for my 35 minutes this morning. But today, in Ruth 1, I want you to pay attention to God's working in hard, bitter times. The title of my sermon today, if that's the sort of thing you care about, is Bitter Providence. And we open up Ruth and we see right away a bitter scene. In the first verse, we learn that we are in the time of the Judges. And for anybody who had just read the book of Judges and flipped the page to Ruth, we learn that the time of the Judges was a dark time for Israel. In chapter 2, the book of Judges says that the Lord raised up judges who saved Israel out of the hands of those who had plundered them. Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they whored after other gods and bowed down to them. And then the very last verse of Judges says this: "In those days there was no king of Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." So we open up to the setting of disobedience and chaos. And we meet this man, Elimelech, and his family. And right away we learn that there's a famine in Israel. So now we're in the time of Judges, but also we're in a time of scarcity. So Elimelech leaves, he takes his family, and they go to the land of Moab. Now we might think that this is an honorable thing, for it is honorable for a man to take care of his own family. But we need to understand this in historical context. This is not quite the same thing as a Dust Bowl farmer in Kansas moving to the more fertile fields of California. No, this was a promised land that God had given to his people, and Elimelech was part of a family that had a particular inheritance of land that was permanent. They were not allowed to sell it to anybody outside of the family. It was a permanent inheritance for them to enjoy. And the Lord had promised to take care of his people. So when Elimelech takes his family and abandons the land, he's demonstrating a distrust that God would come through on his word, that God would take care of his people. And no better the fact that they moved to the land of Moab. Moab we learn first of in the book of Genesis. Lot, the nephew of Abraham, is saved from Sodom, and he and his two daughters go up and live in the hills, and they're alone, and his two daughters are seeking, they want to have a family, they want to have offspring, and so they devise this evil plan where they get Lot drunk and sleep with him and deceive him, and they become pregnant. And the oldest daughter has a son, and his name is Moab. And Moab goes and becomes the patriarch of this nation, a nation that becomes pagan, a nation that does not follow the one true God, a nation that ends up trying to curse Israel, ends up at conflict with Israel. There is no love between Moab and Israel. So they go to this nation, to go to this country of Moab, and then we see in verse 3, but Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her two sons. So things right off the bat, not going according to plan. The patriarch of the family, who had taken his family up to the land of Moab to seek provision, has now died. And so now Naomi is left with her two sons, and we learn in the next verse that her two sons marry Moabite women. For anybody who is well-schooled in the Old Testament, you know that this does not make matters better. God is consistently frustrated and angry with his people for marrying into these pagan cultures and marrying wives that bring their pagan gods and bring them into the people of Israel. So this does not make matters much better. The reader would think things are not going so well. And then we read that both the sons die, childless. So now Naomi has left the land that she loves, has gone into a foreign land with foreign people who are not predisposed to like her. She has buried her husband, and now she has buried her two sons. Things are not going well. Now we are left with three hungry widows, Naomi and her two daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, in the land of Moab in the time of the Judges. I know some of this can connect with some of you. I know some of this can strike a chord with some of you. Some of you have had to bury spouses. Some of you have had to bury children. Some of you have had miscarriages. Some of you have had to come into a land where you don't know anybody, a foreign land, and have felt the loneliness that Naomi must be feeling. But then things begin to shift in verse 6, unbeknownst to Naomi. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she learns that the Lord had visited his people and given them food and decides to go back. She must be hungry at this point. Go back to her land, and hopefully God can provide some food there, and hopefully maybe being with her extended family will help. But unbeknownst to her, I think the author here, who it could be David in later times, we're not quite sure. It's obviously someone generations later, at least at David, maybe beyond that. But the author, I think, is signaling something is going on here. He said, the Lord has visited his people. This is good news. This is a rain cloud beginning to swell over a dry prairie. For when God visits his people, he brings blessing and salvation. And we know better than anybody, what do we do every December? We sing carols, we celebrate, we have feasts. Why? Because God visited his people. And with him, he brought salvation. When the Lord turns his face towards his people, when the Lord visits his people, blessing and salvation are on the way. It reminds me of one of my favorite songs, which tells sort of a gospel story through the book of Jonah. The first line of the song is, Nineveh, O Nineveh, the Lord is turning towards you. What good news was that for Nineveh? And what good news is that for God's people? When the Lord turns his face towards you, even when you don't realize that the Lord's face is towards you, it indeed is good news. But I don't think Naomi realizes this, but nevertheless she decides to go home. And in doing so, she tries to convince her daughters-in-law to not go with her. She says, there's nothing for you in Israel. Go back to your homes. Perhaps you can find a husband there. Perhaps you can have a family and children. And her daughters-in-law say no. Obviously, they had built some strong bonds to each other. And we know that this can happen in the midst of tragedy. If you've ever gone through something hard with somebody, there's just a bond that you build with that person that is really hard to explain. And so they turn Naomi down, but then she doubles down. She tells her daughters-in-law, she makes very clear, look, I am a dead end. I don't have any sons for you to marry. And even if I were to somehow get remarried and have sons, are you going to wait 20 years for them to grow up? No, go your own way, go back to your families. And to boot, she makes it very clear that Naomi is not the type of person that Ruth and Orpah want to hitch their wagon to. She says, the hand of God has gone against me. There in verse 13, no, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. She tells them, I'm cursed. God is against me. You do not want to be with me. And so Orpah decides to leave. It's a bitter time for her. She loves Naomi, but she's convinced and she decides to leave. But Ruth clings to Naomi. And that word clings, so verse 14 says, Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. That word is the same word that we see in Genesis 2 when it says that a man shall leave his father and mother and be united with or cling to his wife. This is no small attachment. This is a gluing. This is a clinging and attachment that is not easily broken. So Ruth even says, Naomi says, Ruth, Orpah has left. She's gone back to her own gods. You do the same. You see Ruth is saying, go back to your own gods. My God is against me. My God has cursed me, but perhaps your gods will be kind to you. So go back to your own gods. But here's what Ruth says. She says, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. So Ruth makes this commitment to Naomi that I am not going to leave you, and I'm going to stay by your side until your death. But there's something else going on here, more than just a commitment to Naomi. Notice Ruth says, your God will be my God. And in this moment, and I don't know if it happened here or if Ruth had made the commitment in her heart earlier, but we see Ruth puts all her eggs in the basket of the God of Jacob. And in doing so, God has reached his hand into Moab and called this Moabite widow to be his own. And heaven celebrated, for Ruth was saved and became part of the family of God, adopted to God. Now, you might be skeptical of that. I mean, it seems like she's making more of a commitment to Naomi than she does to God. But listen to what Jesus says in Mark 10 and Matthew 19. He says, "Truly I say to you, there is no one who has left house or brothers or sister or mother or father or children or lands for my sake and for the gospel who will not receive 100-fold in return." Ruth left her homeland. Ruth left whatever extended family she had, really for no prospects at all, other than her loyalty to Naomi and her newfound loyalty to God. Nineveh, O Nineveh, the Lord is turning towards you. The Lord has turned towards Ruth and saved her. So they returned to the land of Judah. And barley harvest, we learned that barley harvest has come. Again, I think another signal from the author that things are changing for the better. But Naomi is still in despair, bitter about the things that have happened to her. We read that as she returns, the people say, "Is this Naomi?" Verse 20, she said to them, "Do not call me Naomi," which means pleasant or sweet. "Call me Mara," which means bitter. "For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So we see Naomi is still in despair. She has judged that the Lord has done these things against her and that the hand of the Lord is against her. I think she's partially right. She's right that the Lord has done these things to her. But she is wrong that the Lord is against her. See, because of the famine, because of the death, because of the tragedy, God reached into Moab to save Ruth. And he had a plan bigger than Ruth or Naomi realized for Ruth. I'm going to spoil a little bit of the end of the story, but because of all this tragedy and as a result of this chain of sin and tragedy and death, Ruth ends up redeeming the family line of Naomi by marrying Boaz. Boaz redeems Naomi's family line, and through Boaz and Ruth is born a child of promise, a child who is a grandfather of the great King David. And of course, we know that King David is the root of a greater king, King Jesus. So this whole time in God's providence, he had a plan for all of this tragedy, all of this sin, all of these terrible circumstances. God was doing something. Naomi just didn't realize. She couldn't see beyond her own circumstance to believe that God might be doing something bigger. But we see that God does this. We see that this is how God works. You know, the title of my sermon is called Bitter Providence, and providence is not something that I think we quite understand the way it's historically been understood. When we think of providence, we think of God's providing for our daily needs. You know, give us this day our daily bread. But historically, the doctrine of providence has referred to God's working in his creation and governing, and actually the confession that we read this morning was talking about the providence of God. It's his governing over all of creation, all of his creatures, that he might be glorified. John Piper defined the providence of God this way: it is the purposeful sovereignty of God. So God's sovereignty refers to his power, his authority to do whatever he pleases with his creation. But his providence is his sovereignty applied. It's God actually exercising that sovereignty to work in all things to his own glory. We see it in Genesis 50:20, when Joseph, who had been sold into slavery by his brothers, now have his brothers coming before him. And his brothers are apologetic as Joseph is saving them. And Joseph said, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." I mean, what did we sing this morning? You take what the enemy meant for evil and you turn it for good. Notice here that Joseph doesn't say that God merely used it for good. He says God intended it for good. This was not God's plan B. God wasn't scrambling after Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery. But God, in his sovereignty and in his providence, was using the sinful actions of men to ultimately glorify himself. Isaiah 45, 6 and 7 says this, "I am the Lord and there is no other. I form light and create darkness. I make well-being and create calamity. I am the Lord who does all these things." He creates calamity, disasters, sicknesses, the hand of the Lord. Why? Because somehow he uses those things to glorify himself. He takes what the enemy means for evil and he turns it for good. Isaiah 46, 9 and 10. Our community group actually memorized this verse this last year. "I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times, things not yet done. Saying, my counsel will stand and I will accomplish all my purpose." God is planning and orchestrating and executing all things that they might work together for his glory and our good. Romans 8:28, "And we know that for those who love God, all things," not some things, not most things, "all things work together for good, for all those who are called according to his purpose." God was working in the famine. He was working in the death of Naomi's sons. He was working even in Moab's wickedness for his glory. But Naomi just couldn't see it. And we also so often fail to see what God is doing. Not just in our tragedies, but in our light inconveniences. We show a lack of trust, a lack of faith, a lack of belief that God is really in control. I've said this many times, but I've heard a lot of you say it. Things like, I got stuck behind this train, just my luck. Just my luck. Oh, of course my car would break down. I mean, just your luck? You deserve hell. You deserve hell. You have rebelled against a holy God, yet God, in his kindness, has placed the judgment owed you onto the shoulders of Jesus Christ, and all things are working for your good. Just your luck? That sort of talk should not be leaving the lips of Christians. I see so often this deep-seated pessimism, as if God or some force in the universe is against us. Brothers, sisters, if God is for us, who can be against us? He's working all things, our tragedies, things that even seem meaningless. He's working them for his glory and our good. We can look to Job for a better example. Here's a man, 10 children, and a lot of cows. A lot of wealth. And Satan asks to ruin him. I mean, first off, did you know that Satan can't do anything that God doesn't allow him to do? But God allows Satan to do this because God, in his good will and his providence, saw it fit to happen. So Satan causes Job to lose everything. All of his children die, all of his wealth gone, his physical health goes down the tube. Look at what Job says in verse 121, chapter 1, verse 21. "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Wonder if in our tragedies that's the praise that is leaving our lips. The Lord has given, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. So Job understand that he was not at the center of the universe, that God was. God is at the center of the universe. So whatever tragedy struck Job, he understood this isn't about me. This is about God and his glory. And I trust him that he will ultimately take care of me, and this is for his glory and my good. Job 13:15, I love this. Though he slay me, I will hope in him. Even if God should take my very life, I will not distrust him. He is God, and I am not. We can have this sort of hope in suffering. That our tragedies, therefore, because God is ultimately in control and governing them, that they are not meaningless. There's this professor, Clyde Kilby, a Christian professor, who wrote these resolutions for mental health. And a lot of the stuff I see around today regarding mental health is just garbage. But this is so good. And these are resolutions centered on God. I love this one. He says, I shall bet my life on the assumption that this world is not idiotic, neither run by an absentee landlord, but that today, this very day, some stroke is being added to the cosmic canvas that in due course I shall understand with joy as a stroke made by the architect, who calls himself Alpha and Omega. God is not an absentee landlord, checking in once in a while to see if everything is okay. No, he is working in every moment, in every day, in every place for his glory and our good. I love what Doug Wilson says when he says, your problems are tailor-made for you. Think about that. The things, the tragedies, even the worst of tragedies that you have faced, God has ordained for your good. Because he wants you to rely on him. Or maybe there's something in that tragedy he wants to teach you. Or maybe there's something that you just can't see that he is doing, like Naomi. That he was going to use Naomi to save the world, to bring about Jesus Christ. Maybe we just can't see it, but we can see it with eyes of faith. Your problems are tailor-made for you, for God's glory, and for his good. And I know for some of you this is hard to swallow. Come on, how could a good God take my husband from me? How could a good God take my child away from me? Beloved, was it not God who gave his only son? Was it not God that placed the wrath owed us on to his one and only begotten Son who knew no sin? He gave his own Son, who was perfect. Yet Isaiah 53 tells us, it pleased the Lord to bruise him. Not that God is some masochist that enjoys pain, but that through the crucifixion, the wrath of God was satisfied and the sins of his people atoned for, that they might live in eternity glorifying his Son forever. That's why Peter in Acts 2 says in his sermon at Pentecost that Jesus was delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't something God merely allowed to happen. It was God's plan that Jesus would suffer and be tortured on that cross and die. And now that cross serves as the greatest emblem of hope the world has ever known. If God can take the most evil thing that has ever happened in our world and turn it into the greatest news that has ever been told in this world, is he not, brothers and sisters, working in your tragedies too? Doesn't this give you hope that God is never on plan B? He's never scrambling for contingencies, but everything that occurs is under his providence, under his sovereignty. It doesn't mean that we call everything good. There is evil, but it means that God is planning to use evil for his ultimate glory. I love how John Piper says it. He says, "For those who trust God in Christ, his sovereignty in suffering is not an unyielding problem, it is an unfailing hope. It means that in the suffering of Christians, neither Satan, nor man, nor nature, nor chance is wielding decisive control. God is sovereign over our suffering, which means it is not meaningless. It is not wrath. It is not ultimately destructive. It is not wanton or heedless. It is purposeful. It is measured. It is wise. It is loving. And it is working for us, in the words of 2 Corinthians 4:16, an eternal weight of glory." Every second of your suffering, of your tragedies, is working for us. Christian, the hand of God is not against you. The universe is not built to spite you. In tragedy, we lift our eyes up, because though we have bitter times, there is one who drank the most bitter cup of all, Jesus Christ. Blessed be the name of the Lord. When we finish communion today, we're going to sing a closing hymn. This is my Father's world. Listen to this third verse. This is my Father's world. Oh, let me ne'er forget that though the wrong seems oft so strong, God is the ruler yet. This is my Father's world. Why should my heart be sad? The Lord is King. Let the heavens ring. God reigns. Let the earth be glad. I want to close with the Apostle Paul, Romans 11. Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments, and how inscrutable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord? Or who has been his counselor? Or who has given a gift to him that he might be repaid? Now listen closely. This is a central aspect of our faith. We have to understand this. And Calvin said to understand the providence of God is great joy. Ignorance of it is great misery. Paul says, for from him and through him and to him are all things. From God, through God, and to God are all things. The sweet things, and yes, the bitter things. The miscarriage, the cancer, the job loss. All those things, I can't always explain how, but all those things are ultimately to his glory. Paul says, to him be glory forever. Amen? Amen. Let's pray. Lord, help us understand as we go through life's inconveniences, as we go through difficulties and tragedies, Lord, that though they taste bitter, Lord, and though they are tragic and evil, that somehow, Lord, you are using them, somehow you have ordained them because they will ultimately glorify your name as you sanctify your people and present us holy before the throne of God. That your Son be glorified forever for what he has done in raising up a people to himself. So God, just work in our hearts, change our attitudes so that as we face these inconveniences in life, we don't immediately go to pessimism or complaining, Lord, but our heart goes to gratitude. So we understand that those inconveniences are somehow under your providence, Lord, that you are using them to sharpen us, that you are using them that something glorious might happen. Lord, that you would be praised forever. We lift all these things in your Son's name. Amen.